The fog still clung heavy to Kimbolton Airfield that cold March morning in 1944. Captain Frank Harrison's hands were trembling, not from the biting English winter, but from what he had witnessed 25,000 feet above Germany. His tail gunner, a quiet kid named Romano, had just shot down 3 Focke-Wulf FW-190s in under 2 minutes. But it wasn't how he did it that haunted Harrison. It was where he was looking. He wasn't sighting down his .50 caliber machine guns. He was watching a complex arrangement of mirrors, firing at angles that seemed mathematically impossible, striking targets no one else could even see. In the brutal, unforgiving skies of World War II, every pilot and gunner fought for survival against overwhelming odds. But for one young man, the battle wasn't just about bullets and bravado. It was about light, reflection, and an audacious vision that defied everything known about aerial combat. What if the deadliest weapon wasn't a new engine or a bigger bomb, but simply a different way of seeing? Before we dive deeper into this incredible true story, tell us, where are you tuning in from today? Let us know in the comments below. Now let's journey back 6 months, to a time when Michael Romano was just another new recruit, unaware of the incredible path that lay before him. The B-17 Flying Fortress, battered but breathing, coughed its last as it taxied to a halt on the rain-slicked runway at Kimbolton. Its engines, still ticking with residual heat, seemed to sigh in the cold March air. Captain Frank Harrison descended the ladder, his flight jacket heavy with the dampness that clung to everything in England. His boots hit the tarmac with a dull thud, but his gait was anything but steady. His hands, though encased in leather gloves, trembled uncontrollably, a tremor that had nothing to do with the biting wind whipping across the airfield. It was the memory of the German sky, of a vision that defied logic, that rattled him to his core. The ground crew, accustomed to the grim faces of returning airmen, offered curt nods. Harrison ignored them, his gaze fixed on the low-slung building that housed intelligence. He walked, not ran, the distance across the tarmac, each step an effort against an unseen current. The drone of other bombers landing, the shouts of the mechanics, the metallic tang of aviation fuel, all faded into a distant hum. His mind replayed the impossible sequence over and over. The black dots of Focke-Wulfs, the sudden, violent explosions, the eerie silence from his tail gunner's position as the enemy aircraft spiraled away. Inside the operational intelligence office, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the low murmur of debriefings. Fluorescent lights, harsh and unforgiving, illuminated maps plastered with mission routes and enemy dispositions. Major Thomas Brennan, the 379th Bombardment Group's intelligence officer, sat hunched over a stack of reports, his face etched with the perpetual weariness of command. He looked up as Harrison entered, noticing the pilot's unusual pallor and the rigid set of his jaw. "Captain Harrison, back already? Your target was Augsburg, wasn't it? Come in, take a seat. How was it out there?" Brennan's voice was flat, professional, already anticipating the usual litany of flak, fighter attacks, and engine failures. Harrison pulled up a chair, the wooden legs scraping against the concrete floor. He took a deep breath, the words catching in his throat. "Major, it wasn't like any other mission." His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Romano. Sergeant Romano. My tail gunner." Brennan raised an eyebrow, a flicker of impatience crossing his features. "Romano. Is he injured?" "Report specifics, Captain." "No, sir. He's fine. More than fine. He shot down 3 Focke-Wulfs, FW-190s, in less than 2 minutes." Harrison forced the words out, his eyes darting, as if expecting the walls to disbelieve him too. A beat of silence. Brennan put down his pen, his gaze sharpening. He'd heard wild claims before, men exhilarated by combat, adrenaline distorting their perception of kills. 3 in 2 minutes, Captain? That's extraordinary. Are you sure of your count? Did you confirm the kills? "I saw them, sir. From the cockpit. Other crews reported them, too. But it's not the half of it." Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone, though they were alone in their corner. He wasn't looking through his conventional sight. He was using mirrors, sir. An arrangement of mirrors he built. He aimed and fired at angles no man could possibly see. He saw them before they were even a threat. Brennan stared, unblinking. A slow, incredulous smile began to form on his lips, quickly suppressed. Mirrors, Harrison? Are you suggesting Sergeant Romano has developed some kind of optical illusion system in his tail turret? We're fighting a war, Captain, not performing parlor tricks. His tone was laced with thinly veiled skepticism, though he tried to keep it professional. Just then, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis, the formidable commander of the 379th Bombardment Group, entered the office, his presence immediately tightening the atmosphere. He was a man of precise order and unflappable logic. He paused by Brennan's desk, overhearing the tail end of Harrison's account. "What's this about parlor tricks, Major?" Lewis's voice was crisp, cutting through the smoky air. Brennan cleared his throat. "Captain Harrison is reporting an exceptionally high number of kills for his tail gunner, Colonel. Sergeant Romano apparently shot down 3 FW-190s on the Augsburg mission. And, claims he did so using a custom-built mirror system." Lewis's gaze, as cold and sharp as the English winter, fixed on Harrison. "A mirror system, Captain? Are you suggesting your gunner is operating a carnival funhouse in the rear of my B-17s? Or perhaps you've been flying too many missions, Harrison. Combat fatigue can play tricks on the mind." There was no humor in his voice, only a stern implication of mental instability. "No, sir. With all due respect, Colonel, I saw it. The whole crew saw it. He didn't just guess. He was tracking them. He saw those FW-190s setting up for the kill, even when they were in our blind spots. He put rounds where they couldn't possibly be. And they went down. Every single one." Harrison's voice was strained, his visible perturbation warring with his duty to report. The sheer impossibility of his own words made him sound almost delirious. Brennan scribbled a note, trying to maintain composure. "Captain, we'll need to interview Sergeant Romano, of course. And have a look at this system of his." His tone conveyed polite dismissal. Lewis merely shook his head. 3 FW-190s in under 2 minutes by a single tail gunner, using mirrors. That's a tall tale, Harrison. You'd think we'd have heard something about this system before. Get your crew debriefed on standard procedure. This isn't the kind of report we need. But the day was far from over. As the remaining B-17s from the Augsburg mission limped back to Kimbolton, their crews, weary and shaken, began their own debriefings. The intelligence officers, initially dismissive, started to piece together an unsettling mosaic. Over a crackling radio, a bomber from the 92nd Bombardment Group, flying in the same formation as Harrison's, reported, saw 2 Focke-Wulfs go down in quick succession after engaging a B-17 on our starboard flank. Smoke, fire, no shoots. Unbelievable precision. Moments later, another crew, this one from the 381st, added, confirmed another FW-190 braking formation and spiraling out of control near the target. Looked like it took a hit to the cockpit. The reports, filtering in through the controlled chaos of post-mission operations, were all eerily consistent. 3 enemy fighters had been unequivocally lost in the vicinity of Harrison's bomber, within the very time frame he had described. Later that evening, after the last debriefing reports were filed, and as the winter night settled heavily over Kimbolton, Brennan received the reconnaissance photographs. They were grainy, black and white, taken by high-flying Spitfires at extreme altitude, but they were undeniable. 3 distinct impact sites, smudges on the German landscape, one even showing the unmistakable debris field of a Focke-Wulf FW-190. The coordinates matched the vicinity of the encounter reported by Harrison. Brennan spread the photographs on his desk, his earlier skepticism dissolving into a chilling awe. Lewis, summoned to witness the photographic evidence, stood beside him, his usually rigid posture softening into an almost imperceptible slump. The light from the single overhead bulb glinted off the glossy prints, illuminating the irrefutable truth. The combat camera footage from Harrison's own B-17 tail turret, though choppy and of limited clarity, showed Romano firing. And in certain frames, just before an explosion registered on the horizon, Romano's head was clearly angled, not towards his primary gun sight, but towards the crudely affixed reflective surfaces within his cramped compartment. He was firing, it seemed, at empty air. A profound silence descended upon the office, broken only by the distant howl of the wind. Lewis, a man who built his career on facts and tactical certainties, found himself utterly devoid of explanation. He looked from the photos to Brennan, a question forming in his eyes that didn't need to be spoken. How? How had a single tail gunner, in the most vulnerable position in a B-17, managed to achieve such an impossible feat? What kind of system, what kind of mind, could turn the chaos of aerial combat into a deadly geometric equation? The mystery of Sergeant Michael Romano, the quiet optical technician turned improbable hero, had just begun. The gray, unforgiving skies of England, perpetually weeping a fine, cold mist, were a stark contrast to the vibrant, bustling streets of Newark, New Jersey. In September 1943, Sergeant Michael Romano, a young man of 23, arrived in this foreign landscape, the faint scent of lens cleaner and polished brass still clinging to his memory. Before the war, he had been an optician in his father's bustling shop, a world of precise measurements, refractive indices, and the delicate art of shaping light to correct human vision. His hands, once accustomed to the minute calibration of optical instruments, the smooth arc of a grinding wheel against raw glass, now felt the cold, impersonal steel of a B-17 flying fortress. His world had shrunk, geometrically, to a claustrophobic metal cylinder at the very rear of a massive bomber. His initial days at Kimbolton Airfield were a blur of training, briefings, and the overwhelming cacophony of wartime operations. The sheer scale of the American 8th Air Force, a swarm of mechanical giants preparing to descend upon Hitler's fortress Europe, was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Michael, ever the observer, took it all in, processing the immense logistics, the grim statistics, and the camaraderie forged in the crucible of shared danger. He was assigned to Captain Frank Harrison's crew, his quiet demeanor a stark contrast to the boisterous banter of men facing an uncertain future. His position, tail gunner, the isolated sentinel at the bomber's most vulnerable point. The tail gunner's position, known grimly as the tailpipe or ass end, was a realm of brutal isolation. Compressed into a minuscule compartment, barely large enough for a man to sit, Michael was separated from the rest of his crew by 20 meters of shuddering fuselage, his only connection a crackling intercom. 2.50 caliber machine guns protruded from the rear, a desperate, defiant gesture against the onslaught. From this solitary perch, he was the bomber's last gasp, the final terrifying line of defense against the relentless predatory attacks of German fighters. The cold, even with electrically heated suits, was bone-deep, a constant companion as the air thinned at 25,000 feet. The roar of the engines was a perpetual, deafening thunder, shaking every rivet, every nerve ending. Above all, there was the profound, gnawing sense of being utterly alone, suspended in a void of ice and enemy fire. His first few missions were a baptism of fire and terror. The concussive blast of his own .50s, the terrifying whistle of approaching cannon shells, the fleeting glimpse of an enemy fighter, a blur of black and white cross, before it vanished. Michael performed his duties with competence, his gaze sweeping the skies, tracking the swift, deadly shapes of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. He learned the routine of evasive maneuvers, the gut-wrenching lurches as the bomber bucked and weaved, trying to escape a fighter's deadly pass. Yet, beneath the layers of fear and adrenaline, something gnawed at him, an almost physical discomfort that transcended the sheer danger. His pre-war experience with lenses, with light and its precise refraction, had honed his vision, not just for clarity, but for what was missing, what was deliberately unseen. The standard tail gunner setup offered a direct field of fire to the rear and slightly to the sides, but it was riddled with insidious blind spots. These were the tactical voids, the dead zones, where a cunning Luftwaffe pilot, schooled in the brutal geometry of aerial combat, could momentarily vanish, position himself, and then strike with devastating effect before the gunner could react. Michael had devoured the intelligence briefings, studying the enemy's favored attack patterns, their spiraling approaches, their lightning-fast passes that exploited these very weaknesses. He could almost feel the presence of the unseen, a phantom threat lurking just beyond the periphery of his vision, a mathematical error in the geometry of defense. He saw not just the enemy, but the path the enemy would take, and the defensive gaps that invited destruction. It was an affront to his very nature, a problem screaming for a solution. One mission, in particular, solidified his conviction. Flying a harrowing raid over Munster, a city notorious for its heavy flak and aggressive fighter opposition, their B-17 had taken several hits. Michael, his hands aching from gripping the twin triggers, had emptied several belts of ammunition, driving off a persistent Bf-109. But just as he thought they were clear, a shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. A FW-190, seemingly materializing from thin air, had positioned itself high and slightly to the left, in a classic blind spot. It had peeled off, cannons blazing, before Michael could even swing his guns. The rounds had raked their bomber's fuselage, ripping through the starboard wing, narrowly missing an engine. The shudder of the aircraft, the chilling proximity of death from an attacker he literally could not see until it was too late, etched itself into his mind. This could not stand. The obsession began subtly, a nagging thought in the quiet hours after missions, fueled by the cold dread of those blind spots. It soon grew into a consuming fire. His mind, accustomed to solving visual puzzles, saw the tail turret not as a fixed vantage point, but as a limited aperture. He began sketching, first on scraps of paper salvaged from discarded manifests, then filling entire notebooks with complex geometric diagrams. Lines, angles, reflections. He was trying to map the unseen, to bend light to his will, to stretch the boundaries of his limited vision. He spent hours in the base library, poring over physics textbooks, dissecting the principles of optics, light refraction, and mirror equations. His crewmates, including Lieutenant James Kowalski, the crew's jovial navigator, noticed the change. Michael, already a quiet, introspective man, became even more withdrawn. He spent his precious off-duty hours not in the smoky, raucous Nissen hut camaraderie, but hunched over his makeshift workbench in their shared barack, surrounded by oddments salvaged from the base. His prized possessions became a collection of discarded dental mirrors he'd somehow cajoled from the base infirmary. Small, angular reflectors used by military dentists for examining hard-to-reach places. These mundane objects, no bigger than a thumb, were his building blocks for a revolution in sight. He'd also acquired shards of broken vehicle mirrors, bits of polished aluminum, and rolls of electrical tape. Any reflective surface he could find. Kowalski, a man who preferred the comfort of a warm pint and a lively game of cards to intricate diagrams, would often find Michael engrossed in his arcane work, the barack's dim light casting long shadows across his hunched form. "Still at it, Mike?" he'd ask, a mixture of genuine concern and bemusement in his voice. "You're going to give yourself a headache with all that figuring. Why not join us for a game of poker? Take your mind off things for a while." Michael would barely look up, his brow furrowed in concentration, a half-eaten K-ration biscuit forgotten beside him. "It's about angles, Jim. Always angles. If you can see the light, you can see the threat. The Luftwaffe exploits our blind spots. But if I can reflect those blind spots, bring them into view, it changes everything." He spoke of 37-degree reflection paths, of relative motion compensation, of neurological reaction times needed to process multiple visual inputs. To Kowalski, it sounded like madness, the abstract ramblings of a man stretched too thin by the constant threat of death. "We thought Mike was losing his mind," Kowalski would later recall in his memoirs, the memory still vivid. He talked about complex calculations and how light travels, and something about the curvature of the fuselage affecting deflection. "For us, it seemed crazy. You just aimed and you shot. That's all there was to it. You didn't need a slide rule and half a dozen mirrors to do it." The other men would cast worried glances at Michael's corner, their expressions a mix of pity and discomfort. They saw the early signs of combat stress, a man retreating into a private, intricate world as a coping mechanism against the horrors they all faced daily. They'd offer him a drink, a sympathetic word, but Michael would politely decline, his focus unbreakable. The walls of Michael's bunk area became a canvas for his growing obsession. Pencil marks, arcs, and intersecting lines covered the corrugated metal, transforming the cramped space into a three-dimensional blueprint of his vision. He crafted crude scale models from salvaged wire and fragments of his precious dental mirrors, painstakingly adjusting their positions, trying to replicate the dynamic, deadly dance of aircraft in combat. He'd shine his flashlight, adjusting tiny mirror fragments, observing how the light bounced, how it created new lines of sight. He wasn't just thinking in 2 dimensions, but in 3, visualizing the complex ballet of dogfights as a series of geometric possibilities. He knew he wasn't building a scientific instrument in a pristine lab. He was working with scraps, in a drafty Nissen hut, under the cover of night, driven by a desperate need for survival. The challenges were immense. Maintaining mirror alignment against the violent vibrations of a bomber, compensating for the aircraft's speed, the enemy's speed, the ballistic drop of his projectiles. It wasn't just about seeing the enemy. It was about seeing where the enemy would be and where his bullets needed to go. But for Michael, it was not an escape. It was a desperate, logical pursuit. He wasn't just observing the behavior of German fighters. He was dissecting the very physics of their approach, searching for the invisible threads that connected them to his gun sights. The isolation of his tail gunner position mirrored the growing isolation in his personal life, as his quest to redefine vision separated him further from his comrades. They saw a quiet man becoming even more withdrawn, perhaps erratic. He saw a problem waiting to be solved, a challenge that, if mastered, could turn the tide of his own survival and that of his crew. The unseen, for Michael Romano, was not a blind spot to be endured, but a puzzle to be illuminated, a challenge to his very understanding of optics and combat. He was determined to find a way to see what was not meant to be seen. By February 1944, the Nissen hut shared by Captain Harrison's crew had taken on the appearance of a peculiar, scientific laboratory, or perhaps a madman's den, depending on who was observing. Sergeant Michael Romano, consumed by his vision, had transformed his small corner. The faint scent of stale cigarette smoke mingled with the metallic tang of wire and the acrid smell of melted glue from his late-night endeavors. His bunk, once a place for rest, was now a workshop. Mathematical equations, hastily scribbled in pencil, covered every available surface of the corrugated steel walls, a testament to weeks of relentless, often frustrating, trial and error. He had started with simple experiments, taping a dental mirror here, a shard of polished aluminum there, trying to catch elusive reflections. His first 3 attempts to create a functional system, however, had been disastrous. The initial arrangement, a crude grid of small, flat mirrors, had proven worse than useless during ground simulations. When he attempted to process the multiple, fragmented images, his mind, accustomed to a single focus point of view, rebelled. The reflected sky, broken into disjointed segments, created a profound sense of visual confusion, a disorienting kaleidoscope that made him feel violently ill. It was like trying to navigate a familiar room by staring at its reflection in the facets of a shattered mirror. He found himself unable to ascertain distance or speed, his spatial awareness warped, his brain struggling to reconcile conflicting inputs. A wave of nausea, cold sweat, and a pounding headache had been the immediate consequences. The second iteration, an attempt at a more curved, panoramic arrangement, fared little better. While the images were less fragmented, the distortions caused by the varying angles of reflection were immense. A distant fighter might appear to be a menacing blur, only to resolve into a harmless cloud formation upon direct observation. The relative positions of enemy aircraft seemed to shift erratically, defying the laws of physics he understood. During a simulated attack, he'd fired at phantom targets, his hands instinctively traversing the guns, while the actual threat remained hidden to his compromised vision. He'd ripped the mirrors down in a fit of frustration, the adhesive tearing away paint, leaving raw, exposed metal. His crewmates watched with a mixture of concern and growing unease. Lieutenant James Kowalski, who had initially tried to distract Romano, now maintained a respectful, if wary, distance. He looked like a man possessed, Kowalski would later describe. He'd just stare at those bits of glass for hours, muttering to himself about focal points and light paths. Then he'd violently tear them down, sometimes shouting. You could almost feel the pressure building up in him. Others whispered about flak happy, a term for airmen suffering from combat fatigue, their minds fractured by the constant exposure to danger. They feared Romano was losing his edge, becoming a liability. Yet, Michael was undeterred. Each failure, though demoralizing, provided invaluable data. He wasn't just building a system. He was teaching his own brain to see differently. The breakthrough came not from a new textbook formula, but from observation, a lifetime of it. He realized his initial approach was too purely theoretical, too rigidly Euclidean. Aerial combat wasn't static geometry. It was a dynamic, fluid dance of predator and prey. German pilots didn't attack in perfectly straight lines. They maneuvered, arced, and twisted, anticipating the evasive actions of their targets. They exploited the curvature of the bomber's fuselage, using it as a shield, approaching in gentle, arcing trajectories that kept them just out of the conventional sight lines for as long as possible. Michael began to sketch not just lines of sight, but paths of approach, mapping how light would bend around the B-17's contours. He integrated this intuitive understanding into his design. What if each mirror didn't just show a static angle, but was calibrated to catch a specific arc of a fighter's approach? What if he could create a composite image in his mind, stitching together peripheral views that, together, revealed the enemy's true trajectory? He envisioned a system that fed him multiple streams of information simultaneously, allowing him to anticipate, not just react. After weeks of obsessive work, fueled by weak tea and K-ration coffee, often working until the first gray light of dawn, Michael finally developed a functional system in mid-February 1944. It consisted of 7 small, meticulously positioned mirrors, each scavenged and painstakingly polished. The central mirror, slightly larger, was positioned just above his main gun sight, giving him a quick reference. But the real ingenuity lay in the 6 peripheral mirrors. These weren't haphazardly placed. They were arranged in a pattern that only Romano fully understood, a 3-dimensional tapestry of reflections designed to capture the exact angles of approach favored by Luftwaffe pilots. Each mirror was angled not just for reflection, but for anticipation. They covered the subtle curved zones of approach, the soft spots where a Focke-Wulf might linger unseen for crucial seconds before its final, deadly dive. He secured them with strong adhesive tape and small, hand-fashioned brackets, ensuring they could withstand the violent vibrations of a B-17 in flight. The system was rudimentary in its construction but profound in its implication. It demanded an extraordinary cognitive feat. Michael needed to process simultaneously 7 reflected images, each showing a different slice of the surrounding sky, while maintaining his primary focus on the main gun sight and calculating lead and deflection. It was, as he conceptualized it, like playing 3-dimensional chess at supersonic speeds, where a split-second misjudgment meant instant death. His pre-war experience as an optician, constantly interpreting complex visual information and making precise adjustments, had inadvertently trained him for this impossible task. He had developed a unique form of spatial intelligence, an almost synesthetic ability to translate multiple visual inputs into a single, cohesive, tactical awareness. He felt the mental strain, a constant, low thrumming behind his eyes, but it was a strain he welcomed, a challenge he was ready to face. The acid test came on March 4, 1944. The target, the ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, deep in Germany. It was a notoriously well-defended objective, a name whispered with dread among bomber crews. Previous raids on Schweinfurt had cost the 8th Air Force catastrophic losses, an aerial meat grinder that earned it the moniker Black Thursday. The air was heavy with unspoken apprehension as Harrison's crew boarded their B-17, the damp morning chill seeping into their bones. As they climbed through the bruised gray clouds, crossing the enemy coast, the tension in the bomber tightened. The flak began first, blossoming in angry black flowers around the formation, shaking the B-17 violently. Then came the fighters. Scores of them, black crosses against the pale sky, darting and weaving like hornets. Michael, strapped into his cramped tail turret, took a deep breath, his knuckles white against the cold steel of his gun handles. Today, his life, and the lives of his crew, depended on his mirrors. He scanned his conventional sight, the familiar crosshairs dancing with the tremors of the plane. His eyes, however, constantly flickered to the peripheral mirrors. The central mirror gave him the immediate rear view, but the upper left mirror caught his attention. A faint, distant glint, just at the edge of the reflection, where no conventional gunner would have a clear line of sight. It was a Focke-Wulf FW-190, a deadly blur, positioning itself high and lateral, preparing for a deflection shot, a maneuver where the fighter shoots perpendicular to the bomber's trajectory, incredibly difficult to execute but devastatingly effective. This was one of the blind spots he had meticulously plotted. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind was eerily calm, processing a torrent of data in milliseconds. He observed the reflection in the upper left mirror, his brain automatically calculating the FW-190's approach rate, its relative speed, its anticipated path. He rotated his twin .50s, not towards the direct rear, but to a position that seemed to be aiming at empty air, a blank patch of sky. His gut clenched, a primal scream of instinct telling him this was wrong, but his intellect, guided by the precise geometry of his mirrors, overrode it. He waited, his finger hovering over the trigger, a bead of sweat tracing a cold path down his temple. Then, he fired. A 3-second burst, a thunderous roar that filled his tiny compartment, the spent casings clattering around his feet. The tracers streamed out, seemingly into the void. The rest of the crew, focused on their own sectors, noticed nothing unusual from the tail. Captain Harrison, battling a stream of cannon fire from the front, certainly couldn't see where Romano was aiming. 15 agonizing seconds later, as the FW-190 should have completed its attack run or peeled away, a different sight greeted the formation. A trail of thick, black smoke began to spiral downwards from high above, growing into a fiery plume. The FW-190, its engine ablaze, tumbled violently, an uncontrolled descent into the gray abyss. Michael watched its death throes in his mirrors, then confirmed it with a quick glance at his main sight. He had hit the German fighter with surgical precision, forcing the pilot to abandon the aircraft. A wave of relief, potent and overwhelming, washed over Michael, quickly followed by a quiet, profound sense of vindication. The system worked. His mirrors, his calculations, his years of optical expertise. It had all culminated in this moment. In the brutal, unforgiving crucible of aerial combat, a young man armed with salvaged mirrors and an extraordinary mind had just seen the unseen and turned a blind spot into a kill zone. It was a small, solitary victory, but for Michael Romano, it was proof. Proof that the impossible was, in fact, merely a matter of perspective. And this was only the beginning. The gray pre-dawn light of March 15, 1944, offered no comfort over Augsburg. The sky was a patchwork of bruised cloud cover and fleeting patches of weak sunlight, a painter's palette of ominous hues. Strong winds at altitude clawed at the bomber formation, scattering it more widely than the tactical manuals prescribed, leaving vulnerable gaps in the meticulously planned defensive box. For the crews of the 379th Bombardment Group, this meant a higher risk, a more brutal fight for survival against a Luftwaffe known for its ferocity. Captain Frank Harrison's B-17, the Iron Duchess, found itself in a precarious position, hugging the outer edge of the dispersed formation. Its flanks, typically protected by a squadron of compatriots, were now exposed, a tempting target for any lurking enemy fighter. Down in the tail, Sergeant Michael Romano felt the increased buffeting of the wind, the subtle shifts in altitude, and the nervous tension humming through the intercom. He ran a gloved hand over the smooth, cold surface of one of his mirrors, a silent prayer of focus before the storm. The storm, when it broke, was swift and coordinated. A swarm, a tactical formation of 4 German fighters, descended with the precision of a hunting pack. Michael's internal alarms, honed by weeks of observation and the uncanny insights provided by his mirror system, immediately flared. In his main gun sight, he saw the initial feint, 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, silver blurs, diving head-on from high above, splitting to draw the attention of the nose gunners and the dorsal turret. It was a classic diversion, designed to create momentary chaos, to sow doubt and misdirection. But in his peripheral mirrors, Michael saw the truth. The upper right mirror reflected a Focke-Wulf FW-190, a squat, menacing shape, peeling off from the main attack and beginning its arc from a lateral rear position. Simultaneously, in the lower left mirror, another FW-190 became visible, taking a slightly different, lower approach angle. They were not 2 isolated attackers. They were working in deadly concert, preparing a synchronized attack from the rear, designed to split Michael's attention and overwhelm his defensive capabilities. A conventional tail gunner would be forced to make a desperate choice: engage one, and pray the other's rounds found nothing vital. But Michael Romano saw more. His mind, a finely tuned instrument of optical geometry and tactical foresight, ignited. The 7 mirrors became 7 windows into a dynamic, 3-dimensional battlefield. His eyes darted, processing the speed, altitude, and trajectory of each reflected image. The Bf-109s, mere distractions, faded from his immediate tactical priority. His focus locked onto the 2 FW-190s, their mirrored images converging in his mind's eye. He was playing three-dimensional chess at over 400 miles per hour, his brain a supercomputer calculating variables no human had ever processed in real time. He saw not just where they were, but where they would be. He noticed a fleeting infinitesimal window, a point of convergence, a temporal alignment of perhaps 2 seconds, where both FW-190s, in their synchronized arcs, would momentarily pass through a specific, perpendicular plane relative to his bomber. It was a risk, an audacious gamble that defied conventional gunnery, where one always aimed directly at a target. Michael, however, aimed at the future. With extraordinary discipline, he waited. The fighters closed in, their combined speed an astronomical blur, growing larger in his mirrors. His heart hammered, a drumbeat of anticipation, but his hands were steady. He tracked the reflections, his mind refining the trajectories. He allowed the first FW-190 to cross into his peripheral range, then the second. Just as his mirrors showed the precise alignment he had calculated, a moment where both aircraft were perfectly positioned in that fleeting plane, he squeezed the triggers. A deafening roar filled the tail turret as the twin .50s unleashed a torrent of tracer rounds. He wasn't aiming at either fighter directly. He was aiming into the empty space between them, creating a scorching curtain of heavy-caliber projectiles that both FW-190s were destined to fly through in fractions of a second. The stream of tracers, luminous orange against the steel-gray sky, arced out from the bomber's tail, a lethal geometric prediction. The first FW-190, still executing its attack run, flew directly into the brutal hail. Michael watched in his upper right mirror as impacts perforated the engine cowling, a geyser of flame erupting as the fuel tank exploded. The fighter disintegrated in a flash of fire and shrapnel, a gruesome, instantaneous death for the pilot. The second FW-190 pilot, witnessing his wingman vaporize in an instant, reacted instinctively. He broke off his attack, yanking his aircraft upwards and slightly to the left in a violent evasive maneuver, a primal scream of self-preservation. But this reaction, this desperate, unthinking turn, was precisely what Michael Romano had anticipated. Even as the first FW-190 blossomed into fire, Michael was already adjusting his guns, predicting the precise trajectory of the evading aircraft. A second burst, just 2 seconds after the first, stitched a deadly line across the FW-190's cockpit and left wing. The fighter shuddered, its control surfaces shredded, and plummeted into a violent, uncontrolled spin, disappearing into the clouds below, clearly out of the fight. Silence descended, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the B-17's engine roar and Michael's ragged breathing. He had done it. 2 in mere seconds. But the fight was far from over. 30 seconds later, the third target appeared. One of the Bf-109s that had performed the initial frontal feint had circled back, attempting a sneak attack from the rear. The German pilot, a veteran by the look of his tactics, used a broken cloud bank to mask his approach, a common and effective maneuver. Most tail gunners would lose visual contact, struggling to reorient themselves and reacquire the target. But Michael never truly lost him. His mirrors, constantly feeding him continuous spatial awareness, provided a unique advantage. Even as the Bf-109 vanished behind a thick gray cloud, Michael tracked its subtle movements. He used his upper mirrors, specifically calibrated to catch reflections above and through certain atmospheric conditions, to follow the faint bulge and ripple in the cloud formation caused by the German aircraft's turbulence, a fleeting, almost invisible indicator that required extraordinary observation to detect. When the Bf-109 emerged, exactly where Michael had predicted, his guns were already trained on the spot. He fired a short, sharp burst. The opening salvo struck the Bf-109 squarely, chewing into its engine and control cables before the German pilot could even align his own sights. The fighter shuddered, smoke trailing from its engine, and banked sharply, crippled, retreating from the formation. No fiery explosion this time, but a definitive, tactical victory. 3 confirmed kills, not just in 2 minutes, but within a harrowing minute and a half of sustained, coordinated attack. When the Iron Duchess finally touched down at Kimbolton, its fuselage pockmarked but intact, the entire crew was buzzing with a strange mix of terror and elation. Captain Harrison, still reeling from the events, immediately reported Romano's extraordinary performance. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis, who had been so skeptical just days earlier, listened with a grim, unblinking intensity. He recalled Harrison's previous report, dismissed as exaggeration, now confirmed in terrifying detail. Other members of the crew independently corroborated the events. Lieutenant James Kowalski, the navigator, spoke of the sudden, inexplicable explosions of enemy fighters just as Michael had called them out. The radio operator and waist gunners, though unable to see the tail's direct engagements, heard Michael's rapid-fire calls over the intercom and witnessed the subsequent destruction. Even the bombardier, far forward in the nose, confirmed seeing 3 distinct German aircraft go down in the vicinity of their bomber within an incredibly short span. Their accounts, despite their varied perspectives, painted a consistent picture of utter devastation wrought by a single gunner. Crucially, the raw, grainy footage from the bomber's tail camera, though of limited quality due to the vibrations and combat conditions, provided irrefutable visual evidence. It showed Sergeant Romano, head tilted, eyes darting between his intricate mirror array, firing his .50s into what appeared, to the untrained eye, to be empty sections of the sky. Milliseconds later, distant blips on the horizon would erupt in fire or smoke, confirming the impossible accuracy. The film was choppy, a blurred testament, but the correlation was undeniable. The intelligence of the 8th Air Force moved swiftly. A specialized team, led by Major Thomas Brennan, the tactical analysis officer whose earlier skepticism had been shattered, was dispatched to Kimbolton. Brennan, a man of cold, hard data, felt a prickle of professional fascination battling with deep-seated disbelief. He interviewed Romano for hours, the young gunner speaking calmly, methodically, explaining the geometric principles, the angles of refraction, the calculated lead. Then came the examination of the mirror system itself. Brennan, with his team of engineers and optics specialists, crawled into the cramped tail turret of the Iron Duchess. He saw the 7 small, crudely affixed mirrors, the hand-drawn diagrams, the intricate positioning. It was, as he later described it in his official report, rudimentary in physical implementation, yet profound in theoretical application. The engineers confirmed Romano's claims. The mirrors did indeed allow for expanded lines of sight, covering the very blind spots the Luftwaffe exploited. In his comprehensive report, Brennan wrote, Sergeant Romano has independently developed a multi-target acquisition system that theoretically allows for 270 degrees of situational awareness in azimuth and approximately 60 degrees in elevation. While the physical implementation is rudimentary, it is demonstrably functional. However, the cognitive capacity required to simultaneously process multiple visual inputs, maintain tactical awareness across disparate fields of view, and execute precise deflection calculations in a high-speed, high-stress combat environment is extraordinary. This capability is likely limited to individuals with exceptional spatial aptitude and an almost innate understanding of geometric physics. Brennan was simultaneously impressed by the sheer ingenuity and deeply skeptical of its widespread applicability. Romano was an anomaly, an outlier. His system worked, but it worked because of him, not merely because of the mirrors. It was a man, not just a machine, that had achieved the impossible. The events over Augsburg had cemented Michael Romano's reputation, transforming him from an unassuming gunner into a living legend within the 379th Bombardment Group, a testament to what an extraordinary mind could achieve under the most extreme pressure. The question that now hung in the air was not if it worked, but how such a unique, almost superhuman, ability could exist. The remarkable feats of Sergeant Michael Romano, confirmed by Captain Harrison's fervent reports, corroborated by eyewitness accounts, and solidified by grainy tail camera footage, quickly circulated beyond the confines of the 379th Bombardment Group. The tale of the mirror gunner, as some began to call him, reached the highest echelons of the 8th Air Force. In April 1944, a formal ceremony was held at Kimbolton Airfield. Under a crisp, unyielding English sky, with the roar of aircraft taking off and landing as a backdrop, Michael Romano was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. The citation, read with crisp formality by a stern-faced general, specifically mentioned his independent development of an innovative tactical observation system that materially increased the defensive effectiveness of his aircraft. Michael accepted the medal with his usual quiet humility. He stood stiffly at attention, the heavy brass reflecting the pale sunlight, a stark contrast to the makeshift dental mirrors that had truly earned him the honor. For him, The medal was less about personal glory and more about the acknowledgement of a principle, that the unseen could, indeed, be made visible. Yet, even in this moment of official recognition, the underlying truth remained. His system was an extension of his unique mind, not a universally replicable piece of equipment. Michael continued to fly, completing his tour of 30 combat missions by June 1944. He accumulated a confirmed total of 9 enemy kills, an astonishing number for a tail gunner, where the average was typically 2 to 3 for a full tour. Each kill reinforced the legend, a testament to his uncanny ability to see beyond the conventional. Upon his return to the United States, instead of being discharged, Michael was temporarily assigned to the Army Air Force's gunnery training program at Fort Myers, Florida. The military, intrigued by his innovation but grappling with its implications, sought to understand and, if possible, replicate his success. Michael, now an instructor, found himself in a peculiar position. He attempted to teach his mirror technique to new recruits, eager young men fresh from basic training, their minds filled with textbook tactics and conventional wisdom. He stood in simulated tail turrets, the Florida sun beating down on the corrugated metal, far removed from the freezing altitudes of Germany. He patiently explained the geometry, the angles, the mental processing required to synthesize multiple reflected images. He had new recruits meticulously arrange simplified versions of his 7-mirror system. Yet, the results were, at best, mixed. Some gunners, those with an existing flair for spatial reasoning, managed to utilize simplified versions of the system with 2 or 3 mirrors, gaining a slight improvement in peripheral awareness. But none, not a single one, could replicate Michael's proficiency with the full 7-mirror arrangement. The recruits struggled. Their eyes darted, but their minds stumbled. The flood of visual information, instead of providing clarity, induced severe disorientation, headaches, and even motion sickness. They saw disjointed images, not a cohesive battlefield. "It's like trying to watch 7 different movies at once," one frustrated recruit complained, rubbing his temples. "My brain just shuts down." Another simply stared, bewildered, unable to reconcile the conflicting reflections with the actual targets in the simulation. Michael observed, patiently, but internally understood the profound chasm between his innate ability and the average gunner's cognitive capacity. He had spent years, subconsciously, training his brain in the intricate dance of light and perception. It was not a skill that could be taught in a few weeks of accelerated wartime training. A training report from August 1944 bluntly summarized the findings. While Sergeant Romano's system demonstrates valid principles of enhanced situational awareness, its effective implementation requires unusual cognitive capabilities that cannot be rapidly developed through conventional training. It is recommended that future candidates with exceptional spatial aptitude be identified for specialized training. It was a polite, bureaucratic acknowledgement of an inconvenient truth. Michael Romano was an anomaly, not a template. His genius was personal, not easily industrialized. This posed an intriguing dilemma for the 8th Air Force. Here was an undeniable innovation, proven on the battlefield, yet seemingly impossible to widely implement. Why invest in custom-calibrated mirrors for individual gunners, and the arduous, often fruitless, training, when the future of aerial combat technology was already on the horizon? By March 1944, as Michael perfected his artisanal system, the first experimental gyroscopic gun sights were entering service, automatically calculating lead and deflection. Designs for remotely controlled gun turrets, which promised to eliminate the very blind spots Michael had painstakingly compensated for, were already on drawing boards. The era of the individual, handcrafted solution was rapidly giving way to the age of integrated, industrial technology. Michael Romano's mirrors were a brilliant, anachronistic bridge between 2 epochs of warfare. Yet, the principles behind Michael's ingenious system did not simply vanish. His work became a fascinating footnote in the evolution of air combat technology, its significance rippling outward in unexpected ways decades later. During the development of advanced observation systems for jet fighters in the 1950s, Air Force engineers revisited his reports. They studied how Michael had intuitively managed multiple displays of information simultaneously, how he had integrated peripheral awareness with central focus on critical tasks. These very principles, gleaned from his rudimentary mirror system, subtly informed the design of modern fighter cockpits, where pilots must process torrents of information from radar, warning systems, and navigation displays, all while maintaining crucial visual contact with the enemy. Psychologists specializing in human factors also took note, studying Michael's techniques as an early example of what would later be termed crew resource management. The ability to efficiently allocate cognitive attention among multiple, competing sources of information in high-stress environments. His method underscored the importance of integrating disparate visual cues into a coherent tactical picture, a foundational concept for training pilots and aircrews even today. After the war, Michael Romano quietly returned to Newark. The fame, the medals, the fleeting spotlight, he politely sidestepped it all. He resumed his civilian life, stepping back into the familiar, comforting rhythm of his father's optical business. The delicate work of assembling eyeglasses, of grinding lenses to correct human vision, was a welcome contrast to the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat. He lived a deliberately undramatic life, a quiet man who carried the weight of extraordinary experiences with profound modesty. He rarely spoke publicly about his wartime exploits, the memories too raw, too deeply personal. He married, raised a family, and dedicated himself to his craft, fitting frames, polishing glass, helping people see. He passed away in 1992, at the age of 71, his legacy largely unsung outside specialized military circles. In one of the rare interviews he granted to a local historian in 1987, Michael Romano reflected on his mirror system, his voice tinged with the quiet wisdom of age. He sat in his optical shop, surrounded by precision instruments, the faint scent of cleaning solutions in the air. "People think it was genius," he said, his gaze distant, perhaps seeing the phantom trails of long-lost Focke-Wulfs. But honestly, it was just terror transformed into focus. Up there, in that tiny metal cylinder, you had two choices. Accept that there were angles from where death could come without warning, or find a way to see what wasn't supposed to be visible. I chose to see. That choice, to transform vulnerability into an advantage through meticulous observation and a creative, audacious application of basic physical principles, exemplified a spirit that uniquely characterized millions of ordinary soldiers during World War II. It was the era where individual initiative and personal ingenuity could still compete with, and sometimes even surpass, the industrial might of technologically advanced weapon systems. Michael Romano's handcrafted mirror system, built from improvised materials during scarce free time, had temporarily equaled or exceeded the performance that would later cost millions of dollars and years of development to replicate in computerized turrets. It was a vivid demonstration that war, despite its escalating industrialization and reliance on advanced technology, still had profound space for individual human creativity. But it also marked a transition point. Michael Romano was one of the last gunners to significantly modify his armament through artisanal methods. Subsequent wars would see increasingly complex and integrated weapon systems, where individual modification would become impossible or detrimental. His quiet determination to choose to see against all odds stands as a poignant reminder that even in the most technologically driven conflicts, the ingenuity of the human mind remains a decisive, unquantifiable weapon. And so, the journey of Michael Romano, the quiet optician from Newark, culminates not in thunderous explosions or grand strategic victories, but in a subtle, enduring legacy. His distinguished flying cross, a gleaming testament to his singular courage and ingenuity, was but a physical symbol of a far deeper truth. For in the cramped, freezing confines of a B-17 tail turret, armed with little more than salvaged mirrors and an unparalleled mind, Romano transcended the limitations of sight, turning the very laws of physics into a weapon of survival. He proved that even as the gears of industrialized warfare ground relentlessly, the spark of individual human creativity could still blaze, carving out impossible victories from the jaws of certain death. His mirrors, crude and quickly superseded by the relentless march of technology, were never truly about the hardware. They were about a way of seeing, a profound spatial intelligence that recognized the unseen angles, anticipated the predator's arc, and transformed terror into an almost clairvoyant focus. Romano's quiet ingenuity, born of a desperate need to survive, became an unwitting blueprint for the future, informing the complex cockpits of jet fighters and the psychological principles of crew resource management decades later. His story reminds us that true innovation often springs from the most unexpected places, from individuals who refuse to accept what is, instead daring to envision what could be. He was a man who looked at a blind spot and saw not an absence, but a challenge. He saw not the end, but a new beginning. He saw a solution where others only saw death. Michael Romano returned to a life of quiet normalcy, finding solace in the familiar rhythm of lenses and light, leaving the echoes of distant gunfights behind. His reflection, offered decades later, captures the essence of his extraordinary journey. It was just terror transformed into focus. I found a way to see what wasn't supposed to be visible. I chose to see. A choice that reverberates through time, a testament to the power of the human spirit to adapt, innovate, and endure. What do you think of Michael Romano's ingenious system? Would you have had the courage to trust such an unconventional method in the chaos of aerial combat? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you were captivated by this remarkable tale of vision and survival, then you won't want to miss our next deep dive into the hidden stories of World War II. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to WW2 Secret Reports for more untold histories from the greatest conflict the world has ever known.